Right now, on wrists and doorframes and rear-view mirrors across the entire planet, millions of people are wearing a blue glass eye they could not fully explain if you ask them why. It shows up on Instagram jewelry ads and airport gift shops, sold as aesthetic more often than belief, stripped of its original context so thoroughly that most of the people wearing it today would be genuinely surprised to learn how old, how serious, and how geographically vast the fear behind it actually is. And yet the idea underneath it is one of the oldest, most geographically widespread convictions in the history of human religion, that a look delivered with envy or malice can genuinely damage the person it lands on. Not metaphorically, not psychologically, actually, physically, cause illness, misfortune, or ruin, transmitted through nothing more than a glance. The Greeks called it mati, the Italians called it malachio, the Jewish tradition calls it ayin hara, the Hindu tradition calls it drishti or nazar, the Arabic-speaking world calls it ayn al-hasud, the eye of envy. The Ottoman and broader Turkic tradition calls it nazar bonkiu when referring to the protective charm itself, and the belief system it guards against has been documented across Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean, South Asia, the Middle East, and, carried by both trade routes and the transatlantic slave trade, deep into West Africa and the Americas. Civilizations that never traded with each other, never shared a written language, never worshipped the same gods, independently arrived at the identical, oddly specific conclusion. Envy is not simply an emotion. It is a weapon, delivered through the eyes, and it requires a physical defense. Begin in Mesopotamia, where the earliest written evidence of evil eye belief predates almost every other superstition examined across this entire survey. Appearing in Sumerian and Akkadian incantation texts recovered from sites across the ancient Near East, some dating back more than 4,000 years. These texts do not treat the evil eye as folk superstition operating at the margins of official religion. They treat it as a genuine medical and magical emergency requiring precise ritual intervention, cataloged alongside treatments for fever, difficult childbirth, and demonic possession in the same professional repertoire maintained by the Ashipu, the trained exorcist healers of Mesopotamian society. One of the most extensively preserved incantation series, recovered on cuneiform tablets and studied extensively by Assyriologists, personifies the evil eye almost as an independent entity, describing it as having gone forth from the eye of a person, from the eye of a god, wandering the world seeking a victim and settling wherever it finds one, comparable in the texts to a wild bull that is broken loose, requiring a specific counter-incantation, frequently involving salt, water, or specific ritual gestures performed by a professional healer to drive it back out. What is significant here is how thoroughly institutionalized this belief already was at the very beginning of recorded human history. This was not a fringe fear whispered among peasants while official religion looked the other way. Evil eye protection was integrated directly into the formal medical and religious infrastructure of the first cities human beings ever built, suggesting the fear itself, and the felt need to defend against it, is close to coextensive with the beginning of complex, hierarchical, unequal human society itself, precisely the kind of society in which some people visibly, publicly possess more than their neighbors, and in which that visible disparity generates the specific, corrosive social emotion the evil eye belief exists to manage. In Greece, the belief crystallized into mati, extensively documented by classical authors, including Plutarch, who devoted a section of his Moralia to seriously considering the physical mechanism by which a glance alone might transmit genuine harm, proposing that the eye emits a subtle physical substance capable of infecting the object it fixes upon, particularly when charged with the emotional intensity of envy, a theory that treated the evil eye not as supernatural superstition requiring religious explanation, but as a plausible physical phenomenon worthy of the same, a naturalistic inquiry the Greeks applied to any other observable effect in the world. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, cataloged specific populations across the ancient Mediterranean, reputed to possess unusually dangerous evil eye capabilities, including certain Illyrian and North African tribes supposedly capable of killing with a stare alone, treating the phenomenon as a documented ethnographic curiosity rather than mere folk fantasy. Greek protective practice against Mahdi developed its own specific diagnostic and curative ritual, zematiasma, traditionally performed by an older woman possessing inherited knowledge of the correct prayer, who drops olive oil into a bowl of water while reciting a secret formula, interpreting whether the oil disperses or remains gathered as diagnostic confirmation of affliction, followed by a curative prayer whose exact wording is traditionally kept secret and can supposedly only be transmitted from an older woman to a younger relative, and only on specific days of the year, embedding the entire protective tradition within a carefully regulated system of matrilineal ritual knowledge transmission that has persisted in many Greek and Greek diaspora communities into the present day, alongside the blue and white glass Mahdi charm now sold globally as jewelry. In the Jewish tradition, Ayin Hara occupies a position of sufficient theological seriousness that it appears directly within rabbinic legal and ethical literature, not merely folk custom operating alongside official religion. The Talmud records specific rabbinic teachings, taking the phenomenon with considerable gravity. A well-known Talmudic passage attributed to Rabbi Yochanan states that 99 of 100 deaths in the world result from the evil eye, an extraordinary statistical claim reflecting how seriously the danger was considered within mainstream religious authority rather than dismissed as marginal peasant belief. Jacob, in the book of Genesis, instructs his sons traveling to Egypt to enter the city through different gates, specifically to avoid attracting excessive attention and the resulting evil eye that a large, visibly prosperous family group might draw, an interpretation extensively developed in later rabbinic commentary as evidence that even the biblical patriarchs took concrete, practical precautions against the phenomenon. Contemporary Jewish practice preserves the belief primarily through language rather than physical charm. The phrase kenahora, a Yiddish contraction of the Hebrew meaning no evil eye, is still spoken reflexively by many Jewish speakers, religious and secular alike, immediately after mentioning good fortune, health, or a child's accomplishments, functioning as an almost automatic linguistic reflex, specifically designed to avoid the appearance of boastfulness that might attract envious attention and the resulting harm, a striking demonstration of how deeply embedded evil eye logic became in ordinary daily speech patterns, surviving as functional habit long after many speakers using the phrase might describe themselves as not literally believing in the underlying supernatural mechanism at all. In India, the belief takes the form of drishti or nazar, documented across Hindu and to a lesser extent Muslim and Christian communities throughout the subcontinent, with particularly intense protective attention directed toward infants, considered maximally vulnerable to affliction precisely because their beauty and their parents' evident joy at their arrival make them the most likely targets for envious observation. A newborn or young child is frequently marked with a small black dot, kajal or soot, applied to the forehead, cheek, or behind the ear, specifically to introduce a deliberate, minor imperfection into an otherwise flawless appearance, on the theory that a subject too perfect and too openly admired becomes maximally attractive to the harmful gaze, while a small visible flaw redirects or diminishes the envious attention the child would otherwise draw. Homes and businesses across India commonly display a specific talisman called Nimbu Mirchi, a string of one lemon and several green chilies hung near an entrance, refreshed regularly as the original dries out, believed to absorb and neutralize negative energy and evil eye influence directed at whoever passes beneath it, a protective mechanism whose specific botanical logic, sour, bitter, and pungent items considered naturally repellent to malevolent forces recurs in different specific forms, across numerous unrelated evil eye traditions examined throughout this survey. The Ottoman and broader Turkic tradition of Nazar Bonçu, the blue glass eye bead, now globally recognizable as evil eye protection's single most visually iconic form, developed a specific manufacturing and color logic worth examining closely, because the choice of vivid cobalt blue was never arbitrary. In much of the pre-modern Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, blue eyes were comparatively rare among local populations, and rarity itself, according to the most widely accepted scholarly explanation, made blue-eyed individuals disproportionately associated with the evil eye's dangerous, unusual, unsettling gaze, since anything statistically unusual and difficult to fully categorize was more readily suspected of possessing unnatural power. The Nazar Bonçu charm, made from a specific combination of molten glass, salt, and other traditional ingredients that produces its characteristic concentric blue, white, and black rings resembling a staring eye, functions according to a widespread magical principle scholars call apotropaic mimicry, defeating a dangerous gaze, not by hiding from it, but by confronting it directly with an even more intense, even more staring artificial eye, the underlying theory being that the malevolent gaze, encountering an eye staring back with equal or greater intensity, becomes confused, deflected, or absorbed before it can reach its intended human target. This same underlying logic meeting a dangerous gaze with an even more prominent artificial eye, rather than attempting concealment, recurs with remarkable consistency in evil eye protective devices across entirely unrelated cultures, from ancient Egyptian wedged eye amulets to contemporary Greek and Turkish glass beads, suggesting the specific defensive strategy of fighting a staring threat with an even more intense counter-stare represents an independently, repeatedly rediscovered solution to the same perceived problem. In Italy, and particularly in Naples, where the belief system reached an unusually elaborate and enduring cultural expression, Malacchio developed alongside a specifically gendered protective symbol, the cornicello, a small curved horn, traditionally red, worn as jewelry or hung in homes and vehicles, its shape widely interpreted as simultaneously representing an animal horn associated with virility, protection, and the warding power traditionally attributed to horned animals across much of the pre-Christian Mediterranean world, and a specific hand gesture called the mano cornuta, formed by extending the index and small fingers while folding the middle fingers down, still used throughout southern Italy as an immediate, instinctive, protective response whenever someone praises a person, child, or possession too effusively, functioning as a real-time, physical countermeasure against the evil eye the excessive praise might have inadvertently invited. Neapolitan folk tradition developed an extraordinarily specific taxonomy, distinguishing between malacchio caused by deliberate malicious envy and jettatura, harm caused entirely unintentionally by certain individuals simply born with an inherently dangerous gaze, regardless of their actual feelings or intentions toward the person harmed, a genuinely sophisticated theological distinction separating moral culpability from mechanical, involuntary harm, comparable in its careful precision to the kind of legal reasoning more typically associated with formal religious jurisprudence than casual folk superstition. In the Islamic tradition, the evil eye, referred to across Arabic-speaking regions as Ayn al-Hasud, receives direct textual grounding in the Quran itself, specifically in Surah al-Falaq, one of the two final short chapters traditionally recited together for protection, which explicitly instructs believers to seek refuge from the evil of an envier when he envies, embedding evil eye protection directly within core, universally recited scripture, rather than leaving it as extra-textual folk custom operating alongside official doctrine. The Prophet Muhammad is recorded across multiple hadith collections, explicitly affirming the evil eye's genuine reality, with one widely cited tradition stating directly that the evil eye is real, and recommending specific protective practices, including reciting particular Quranic verses over oneself or one's children, and, notably, the practice of ruqya, a form of spiritual healing involving recitation of specific Quranic passages over an afflicted person believed to be suffering from evil eye affliction, jinn possession, or related spiritual harm. The widespread Islamic custom of saying mashallah, meaning roughly, what God has willed, immediately upon observing or praising something beautiful, impressive, or fortunate, a child's good health, a successful harvest, an attractive new possession, functions as a direct linguistic protective mechanism, precisely parallel to the Yiddish kenahora already examined, explicitly attributing the praised quality to divine will rather than personal merit or possession, a grammatical humility understood to specifically diffuse the envy that unqualified, self-attributed praise might otherwise invite. In West Africa, and following the specific historical pathway of the transatlantic slave trade across Brazil and much of the wider African diaspora in the Americas, evil eye belief traveled and transformed into practices including the figa, a clenched fist with the thumb protruding between the index and middle fingers, worn as jewelry or carved into decorative objects, functioning as a protective gesture against olho gordo, literally fat eye, the Brazilian Portuguese term for envious harm, whose specific gestural logic and aggressive, sexually suggestive hand shape deployed defensively closely parallels the Italian mano cornuda's combination of protective and mildly transgressive symbolism, arrived at through independent development among enslaved and colonized populations forcibly transported across an ocean, carrying fragments of West and Central African protective tradition that fused, in the specific crucible of colonial Brazil, with Portuguese Catholic folk practice and indigenous Brazilian belief, into a genuinely new, syncretic, protective vocabulary addressing what remained, across every one of the traditions feeding into it, the identical underlying fear. In Egypt, the protective counter-eye tradition already gestured toward in the discussion of Nazar Bonku deserves fuller examination in its own right, because the wedjat, commonly known today as the Eye of Horus, represents one of the oldest and most theologically elaborate versions of the apotropaic mimicry principle found anywhere in this survey. According to the myth, the god Horus loses his eye, or in some versions has it torn to pieces, during his prolonged combat with his uncle Set, avenging the murder of his father Osiris in the succession narrative already examined in the context of sibling conflict mythology. The god Thoth, associated with wisdom, writing, and healing, magically restores or reassembles the damaged eye, transforming it into the wedjat, a symbol whose name means, roughly, the whole one or the sound one, marking it specifically as an emblem of restoration and completeness following injury rather than an eye that was never wounded at all. This origin gives the wedjat a subtly different theological character than the simpler protective eyes examined elsewhere in this survey. It is not merely a staring countergaze meant to intimidate or confuse a hostile look, but specifically a wounded eye that has been healed, carried afterward as proof that damage, even damage inflicted by the most dangerous possible attacker, can be repaired. Ancient Egyptians wore wedjat amulets in extraordinary numbers, buried them with the dead specifically to protect the body and soul during the dangerous underworld journey already examined in the broader context of Egyptian afterlife belief, and painted them on the sides of coffins and on the prows of boats, where the symbol's protective, all-seeing gaze was believed to guard against hazards navigators could not always see coming themselves. The wedjat's enormous popularity and remarkable longevity, the symbol remained in continuous use for well over 2,000 years of Egyptian history and iconographically influenced protective eye symbolism across the wider, ancient Mediterranean world demonstrates that the specific logic connecting eyes, protection, and restoration after harm was not a marginal superstition, even within one of antiquity's most sophisticated, literate civilizations, but a core, continuously reinforced element of mainstream Egyptian religious and funerary practice. So why does this single, remarkably specific belief that envious observation transmits genuine physical harm through the eyes, requiring active, physical, frequently eye-shaped countermeasures recur with such extraordinary consistency across civilizations with no meaningful contact, when so many of humanity's other supernatural fears took such radically different forms in different places? The anthropologist George Foster, studying evil eye belief across multiple peasant societies in the mid-20th century, proposed an influential explanation rooted not in psychology but in social economics. Traditional agricultural societies frequently operated according to what Foster termed the image of limited good, an implicit cultural assumption that the total available wealth, health, luck, and fortune within a community existed in a genuinely fixed, finite quantity, meaning any individual's visible gain, a particularly abundant harvest, a healthy new child, a prosperous new possession, was not simply good fortune for that individual, but was implicitly understood, at some level, as a corresponding loss redistributed away from everyone else in the community. In a social and economic environment governed by this zero-sum assumption, open, visible displays of prosperity became genuinely dangerous in a way modern, growth-oriented economic thinking struggles to fully appreciate, because a neighbor's abundance was not simply a fact to be admired or ignored, but potential evidence of a corresponding, real diminishment in what remained available to everyone else. And the evil eye belief, in this reading, functions as a powerful, self-enforcing mechanism of social leveling, a built-in cultural pressure discouraging excessive visible accumulation and encouraging the specific, ritualized modesty deflecting praise, marking children with a deliberate flaw, attributing success to divine will rather than personal merit, visible across every single tradition examined in this survey. Because the community's collective fear of the harm envy could cause functioned as a genuinely effective check against the open displays of inequality that might otherwise destabilize the tightly interdependent social fabric. Small, resource-limited agricultural communities required to survive. The blue glass bead, sold today as fashion accessory, carries, whether its wearer knows it or not, the accumulated weight of 4,000 years of human societies working out independently and repeatedly the same difficult truth that being watched with envy is not a neutral experience, and that the people around you noticing what you have is never entirely without consequence.